South Africa's population reaching 62 million last year. Now, Gauteng with the highest population of 15 million, followed by KwaZulu-Natal, 12.4 million. Now, more than 80% of households had access to piped water, while over 90% had access to electricity for lighting. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa saying that while the data shows that strides have been made, these numbers will also help government to identify how to deploy its resources. But is there even resources to speak about, especially when you look at our economic growth? Let's speak now to Kevin Lings, who's STANLIB's chief economist. Thank you so much, Kevin, for your time this afternoon. I mean, economic growth certainly not appearing to be matching the population growth.
Unfortunately, that's exactly right. If you look at the last 10 years, the economic growth rate of South Africa has averaged 0.8% a year. The population growth is sitting at 1.6% a year. So population growth way exceeding economic growth. And under those conditions, obviously, the economy goes backwards. Income declines on a per capita basis, and living standards come under enormous pressure. It also exacerbates inequality, whether it's income inequality or wealth inequality. And clearly, it exacerbates the unemployment rate. So the basic problem is we're just not growing the economy fast enough to cope with the size and the growth of the population.
And one then would ask, is there any tangible evidence that you have seen, some have seen, to say that we are trying to grow the economy as fast as we should?
So there are some developments that are encouraging in the short term. Obviously, reducing electricity outages, so the efforts to try and get the Kusile units functioning, the Medupi unit, the Kuberg units, all of that would help to reduce load shedding. And if we do that in its own, we would obviously be able to lift economic growth. And potentially we could go back to 2% growth within the next year and a half. So that's feasible. Obviously, we would expect at some point to start to cut interest rates. Interest rates have been fairly high in South Africa, and inflation's reasonably under control. So we would start to cut interest rates, and naturally that would help the economy. So that could give us some relief and maybe take the growth rate closer to 2%. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't give us a structural uplift in economic growth. In other words, what do we have to do to get the growth rate up at 3%, 4%, 5%, and then see if we can sustain it at that level? Then we make a real difference to people's lives. And I haven't seen enough being put in place to get us to that type of growth rate. 2% would help, but it's not going to make a big difference quick enough to change people's lives.
And Kevin, you talk about, that very point of changing people's lives. Yesterday, when the president was receiving this data from Statistics South Africa, saying that we've seen that some strides have been made, but we've seen areas of concern where we now need to put resources in order to be able to improve service delivery and make people's lives better. But what does it mean then if the economy is not growing fast enough for those people who are waiting to be able to get access to services?
So it puts them in a very difficult position, because one of the byproducts of not growing the economy fast is you don't generate a good tax base. South Africa actually has a very narrow tax base, and the way to get government, if you like, more money so they can provide service delivery is to broaden the tax base, broaden employment, and make sure that government's tax collection can improve. And therefore, obviously, if you've got a bit more money, then you can make better strides in terms of service delivery. What we're finding at the moment is now we're looking at another revenue shortfall that the minister is probably going to update us on the 1st of November. And if we continue to grow this economy at around 1%, then tax revenue will remain problematic. And more importantly, if we look at the ability for municipalities to collect revenue, that's also going to be problematic, because people are struggling, people are under pressure, there aren't opportunities. So it starts to feed on itself. And because it feeds on itself and you can't provide service delivery, then you aggravate the situation further. There's no shortcut. There's no other alternative. You've got to lift the growth rate, and you've got to lift the growth rate by investing in the critical areas. And in this case, in South Africa, those critical areas right now is energy and anything to do with transport, road transport, rail transport, certainly the port capacity. I would put water as part of that. So it's very clear where we've got the big shortcomings, where we need to focus our our time and energy and get those areas developing quicker. And then we can start to make a more of a structural impact. But without that, people's lives aren't going to improve materially in terms of service delivery.
Especially if we're still talking about the fact that you've got more people now moving into certain areas. For example, Gauteng even seeing an increase, and we're talking capacity issues. But while you talk about capacity issues, you're still having a conversation about infrastructure that is crumbling, and that also needs its own investment.
That's right. So it's now the most critical area. You could list a whole range of things that need urgent attention, but it's key infrastructure that is at the top of the list. And that includes vital things like water, sanitation. It's not just about electricity. And what's happening is that because the infrastructure in the smaller towns has deteriorated more significantly, people move into the bigger cities, the big metro areas. And if you talk about population growth rate, Gauteng has a population growth rate that is well over 2%. And I mean, if you think the country is growing at 1.6%, the big municipalities have population growth rates way in excess of that. And it puts even more strain on their infrastructure. And obviously, they're not able to cope with it under normal circumstances. So the situation will simply get worse until we recognize that we've got to put in a way bigger effort to drive this economic growth. It's achievable. It's not like it's not possible. It's achievable, but it does require a more focused policy initiative from government.
All right, Kevin, it does look like, while those numbers are being unpacked, they have to be unpacked in the context of where South Africa finds itself right now, particularly seeing that we're going to an election next year. But let me thank you so much for your time and those insights. Do appreciate them. That is Kevin Lings, STANLIB's chief economist.